Every morning, an old man sat alone on the same park bench, invisible to a world that rushed past him. He had a son who never called, a wife he had lost, and a heart full of words he never said. He believed his story would end quietly, unnoticed, forgotten. And then one cold morning, a crying little boy sat down at the other end of his bench. And what happened next would save not one life, but three. This is a story about loneliness, second chances, and the truth that no one is ever truly invisible. Every morning, at exactly 7 o'clock, an old man named Ray sat down on the same wooden bench in Hollow Park. He was 78 years old. His coat was gray and worn at the elbows. His hands shook a little as he scattered crumbs for the pigeons that gathered at his feet, the only living things in the whole world that seemed happy to see him. This bench was not just any bench. 50 years ago, on a spring morning just like this one, Ray had sat on this very spot and asked a young woman named Eleanor to marry him. She had laughed and cried and said yes. And for 50 years after that, they had returned to this bench together, on anniversaries, on quiet Sundays, on the day their son was born, and on the days when life felt too heavy to carry alone. But Eleanor was gone now. 3 winters had passed since the morning Ray woke up and reached across the bed and found it cold. 3 years since the house had gone silent. 3 years since anyone had called him by the name only she used, My Ray. Now he came to the bench alone, and every morning he spoke to her as if she were still sitting beside him. "Cold one today, love," he would say softly. "You'd have made me wear the scarf." The world moved around him in a blur. Joggers ran past, earphones in, eyes forward. Mothers pushed prams without looking up. Teenagers laughed, glued to their phones. Not one of them saw the old man on the bench. Not one of them knew that he had once been young, that he had fought in a war, that he had built houses with his own 2 hands, that he had loved a woman so completely that he still set 2 cups of tea every morning out of habit, and poured one down the sink. Ray had a son too, David, a grown man now, living 300 miles away in a city of glass and noise. David was busy. There was always a meeting, always a deadline, always a reason. The phone calls had grown shorter over the years, then rarer, until they came only on birthdays, and even then, Ray could hear the impatience in his son's voice, the relief when the call could end. It hadn't always been that way, but Ray knew, deep down, that the silence between them was a wall he had helped to build. He had been a hard father, a man of his time. He had worked himself to the bone to give David everything, except the 2 words the boy had actually needed to hear. "I'm proud. I love you." Ray had felt those things every single day. He had just never learned how to say them out loud. And now the years had hardened into distance, and the distance into silence. So Ray sat on his bench, invisible to a world that rushed past, carrying a heart full of words he had never said, and a love he no longer knew where to put. He had begun to believe that this was simply how his story would end. Quietly, unnoticed, a forgotten old man feeding pigeons until the morning came when he too would not wake up. And then on a gray Tuesday in October, something changed. A boy sat down at the far end of the bench. He couldn't have been more than 11 or 12. A school bag sat heavy on his shoulders, though it was long past the school hour. His shoes were scuffed, his jacket too thin for the cold. He stared straight ahead at nothing, his small jaw tight, his eyes red around the edges, like he had been crying and was trying very hard to pretend he hadn't. Neither did Ray. They simply sat there, an old man at one end, a small boy at the other. 2 people the world had forgotten, sharing the same quiet bench under the same gray sky. After a while, the boy stood up and walked away without a glance. But the next morning, at 7 o'clock, he was there again. For a week, the old man and the boy sat in silence. Then one cold morning, Ray reached into his coat, pulled out half a sandwich wrapped in paper, and held it out without a word. The boy stared at it for a long moment, suspicious, the way wounded animals are suspicious of kindness. Then his hunger won. He took it. He ate it in 4 quick bites. "Slow down, son," Ray said gently. "It's not going anywhere." It was the first thing either of them had said, and it cracked something open. His name was Sam. He was 11. And over the days and weeks that followed, in little pieces, the story came out, the way hard truths always do, sideways and slow. Sam's home was not a home anymore. His father had left 2 years ago and never came back. His mother worked 2 jobs and came home exhausted, with nothing left to give. There was shouting some nights, and silence on others, and the silence was worse. Sam had learned to make himself small, to disappear, to take up no space at all. At school he was the quiet one, the invisible one. So every morning he left for school early, and instead came here, to this bench, where at least the loneliness was peaceful. Ray listened, really listened, the way no one had listened to that boy in a very long time. And something in the old man, something that had been frozen for 3 years, slowly began to thaw. He started bringing 2 sandwiches. He started bringing a flask of hot chocolate on the coldest days. And he started to talk about Eleanor, about the war, about the houses he had built, about a life that had been full and loud and beautiful before it went quiet. Sam listened with wide eyes. To Sam, this old man wasn't invisible at all. He was the most interesting person in the world. For the first time in years, Ray had a reason to wake up. For the first time in years, Sam had someone who saw him. 2 broken hearts, mending each other on a wooden bench. One afternoon, Sam asked the question that would change everything. "Ray, do you have any kids?" The old man was quiet for a long time. Then he told Sam the truth, about David, about the son he loved more than his own life, and the words he had never managed to say, and the silence that had grown between them, like a winter that never ended. "Why don't you just call him?" Sam asked, in the simple, fearless way that only children can. "It's not that easy, son," Ray said. "Too many years. Too much I got wrong." Sam looked up at him, this small boy with an old soul, and he said something Ray would never forget. "But you're always telling me it's never too late. You said that to me. Were you lying?" Ray had no answer. That night, for the first time in 3 years, the old man sat at his kitchen table, took out a pen and a sheet of paper, and began to write a letter to his son. He wrote down all the things he had never said. "I'm proud of you. I'm sorry. I love you. I always did. I just didn't know how to show it." His old hand shook, and tears fell onto the page and smudged the ink, but he kept writing until it was done. The next morning he showed Sam the envelope, stamped and ready to post. The boy grinned, the first real full grin Ray had ever seen on his face. "See," Sam said, "it's never too late." Ray laughed, and the sound surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed. But as he stood up from the bench that morning, a sharp pain bloomed in his chest, and the world tilted for just a moment before it settled. Ray steadied himself on the armrest and said nothing. He didn't want to frighten the boy. He just looked at Sam, this child who had brought him back to life, and felt a gratitude so deep it ached. Winter came hard that year. One morning, Sam arrived at the bench at 7 o'clock, his breath fogging in the freezing air, and the bench was empty. He told himself Ray was just late. He waited. An hour passed, then 2. The pigeons came, looking for crumbs that never fell, and slowly drifted away. Ray didn't come the next day either, or the day after. Sam felt a cold dread he couldn't name. He didn't know where Ray lived. He didn't even know his last name. For days the boy returned to the empty bench, sitting alone where the old man used to sit, willing him to appear. Then, on the 7th day, a man Sam had never seen before walked slowly across the park toward him. A man in his 50s, with tired eyes and a grief-worn face, and something heartbreakingly familiar in the way he carried himself. "Are you Sam?" the man asked softly. The boy nodded. afraid. "My name is David," the man said, his voice breaking. "I'm Ray's son." And then he told him. Ray had passed away peacefully in the hospital 4 days earlier. His heart, the doctor said, it had simply grown tired. Sam felt the world go silent. He couldn't breathe. The one person who had seen him, who had saved him, was gone. But David knelt down in front of the boy, and through his own tears, he told him the rest of the story. A week earlier, David had received a letter from a father he had not truly spoken to in years. He had read it standing in his kitchen, 300 miles away, and he had wept like a child. And then he had dropped everything, gotten in his car, and driven through the night to reach his father. They had 3 days together, 3 precious days at the end of a lifetime. David had held his father's hand, and finally heard the words he had waited his whole life to hear, and had finally said them back. "I forgive you. Thank you." "He told me about you," David said, looking at the boy. "In his last days he talked about you constantly." The boy on the bench. "He said you gave him a reason to write that letter. He said you gave me my father back, before it was too late." David's voice cracked completely. "You didn't just save him, Sam. You saved us." Then David reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. On the front, in a shaky, familiar hand, was written one word: Sam. The boy's fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter, and folded within it enough money to carry a child through years of school. Every penny Ray had set aside, left to a boy he had known for only a few short months. But it was the words Sam would carry for the rest of his life. The old man had written, "Sam, you told me it's never too late. You were right. You gave an old man back his son and his life in the time he had left. Whatever the world tells you, however invisible you feel, remember this: you were seen, you mattered, you changed everything. Now go and live a life big enough for the both of us. And one day when you see a lonely soul sitting alone on a bench, sit down beside them. That's all it ever takes. Ray." In the spring, a small brass plaque was fixed to that old wooden bench in Hollow Park. It read, "For Ray and Eleanor, who sat here for 50 years, and for everyone who ever felt invisible. Someone always sees you." Many, many years later, an old man sat on that same bench, feeding the pigeons in the soft morning light. His coat was worn at the elbows. His name was Sam. And when he saw a young girl sit down at the far end of the bench, alone, school bag heavy on her shoulders, eyes red from tears she was trying so hard to hide, the old man smiled gently, reached into his coat, and pulled out half a sandwich. "Cold one today," he said softly. "It's not going anywhere. Slow down." And the kindness of one old man, given freely on a wooden bench, went on living, passed from one lonely heart to the next, forever.